Volume 3 is finally here!
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10.
Black Lives Matter.
URUSEI YATSURA, an ancient manga with a brand new release that we're gonna talk about. I did a review of Volume 1 a while ago. I didn't cover Volume 2 when it came out, but Volume 3 just came out. Well, sorta just came out. I'm a little late. So we're gonna be talking about Volumes 2 and 3 today. Those that are already vaguely familiar with this series will get the most out of this video, but hopefully newcomers should be able to follow. So, if you're new, I'd say go check out the other videos I've done on the series, but first, I've got to address something about one of those videos quickly. I did what the kids nowadays typically refer to as an oopsie. Made a pretty big oopsie in my Volume 1 review, and that was attributing most of the credit to Viz Media, who were only responsible for the translation. Now, in my defense, I don't have many resources available. See, Dragon Ball fans have Kanzenshu, a small, dedicated community of fans that bridge the gap between the Japanese and English sides of the fandom. With their help, we can easily delineate what comes courtesy of Japan and what comes courtesy of the United States. Unfortunately, us Urusei fans don't have that luxury. Urusei fans are busy either talking about their ugly cats or making bad podcasts, so that leaves me out here all alone to try and decipher what is and isn't courtesy of my country. Now, all this isn't to say that I'm not embarrassed by my mistake. It was still pretty dumb. Perhaps I should explain. So, each volume comes with some extra material. In addition to just the chapters, you get the data file, a short article about a particular character or setting in the series, count column, which is just some fun trivia, and a notes section which goes over all of the obscure Japanese references. Now, the notes section is courtesy of Viz, but the other two are not. It was weird of me to assume that they were, especially since we can look to the bottom of the page and see that it was written by.
你真是一个好向导.
These extra sections come courtesy of the Japanese releases of these books. In fact, these Japanese releases are likely the reason we're getting the translation at all. Still, I'm glad that Viz actually bothered to make a new translation rather than just recycle their old one like they do with every new release of Dragon Ball. I still feel my Volume 1 review was good enough despite this flaw. I otherwise stand by everything I said in that video. However, I definitely don't want to make the same mistake again, so I'm going to break this fucking book down into its goddamn constituent parts, Nova Canoe style. I'll be talking about the layout of the book itself, brief thoughts on the translation, and then the actual story itself, probably not in that order. Let's take a look at the actual physical book itself. I don't have the best footage of this stuff, so you're gonna have to bear with me on this one. The book is pretty big. Not just in terms of the number of pages, but also the actual size of each page. Page quality is pretty great as well. Everything looks super clean. The pages are nice and thick, so you can't see through to the other side of the page unless you really try to, if that makes sense. There was one weird thing I saw in Volume 3, though. For some reason at the bottom of this page, there's a large ink blot. I own a digital copy of the manga as well, and it didn't have this mark, which leads me to believe that this was some weird misprinting issue. This is the first and only time I've ever seen something like this, and the only thing that was obscured was this chick's leg, which I'll survive without seeing. Still, I felt like it was important to mention for the kind of people that really care about that sort of thing. Oh, and I obviously hope this sort of thing doesn't happen again. I don't want to see any cute booby pics get obscured.
Oh, hey!
I spoke to a friend of mine who also owns a copy, and his copy doesn't have this issue, so I'm hoping that this isn't a widespread issue and I was the only one affected. This was the only issue I had as well. Everything else about my copy was fine. One thing I do have to criticize, however, is the choice of art on the cover. Now, Volume 1 is perfect. This drawing of Lum is very consistent with how she's drawn in these chapters. Volume 2 is a little odd. If you compare the drawing of Lum on the cover to drawings of her in the manga, there's a noticeable difference. However, it's not too unfitting. The cover prominently features Ataru, Lum, and Mendo. Mendo's inclusion makes sense since he's introduced in this volume. Shinobu is hiding on the back, which is honestly pretty perfect for reasons we'll get to later as we talk about the story. Volume 3, on the other hand, is where things get confusing. When I saw this, I got excited to make this video. Up at the top of the page we see this character, who looks like a boy but is actually a girl. Her name is Ryunosuke, and I was ready to destroy social media as we know it with the mother of all hot takes regarding the character.
Sex in giant vats of feces.
But then I thought about it and... Wait, what the fuck? We're not near the part of the story where she gets introduced. In fact, we're not even close. This cover features a bunch of characters that don't appear in the story. Ryunosuke, her father, Ten, Kotatsu Neko, and Sugar all appear on the cover despite not appearing in the story, and some of them are not going to appear for a while.
Who are you people?
Meanwhile, Ren, the one major character that actually does get introduced in this volume, doesn't appear on the cover at all. Even stranger was when I took a look at the cover art for Volume 4.
Excellent!
Many of the chapters featured in Volume 3 were likely written during the summer, since there's lots of visits to the beach in Mendo's vacation home, as well as an entire chapter about summer ending. This cover would have been perfect, but instead it's being reserved for Volume 4, where Ten, one of the many characters on Volume 3's cover, is introduced.
I am so confused!
I still like the art quite a bit, but it almost borders on false advertising since it's not a good indicator of the style of art or the story of the volume you're about to read. Hopefully with future volumes this issue gets remedied, but if it doesn't, it's not the biggest deal in the world. The data file and count column make a return. The count column is a fun addition, but you could skip it and not miss much. The data file, on the other hand, is a very generous bonus. I think these articles give an incentive to read to those that are already familiar with the stories, perhaps through the animated adaptation like I was. I was able to understand this, for example, from watching the animated adaptation. In Volume 2's data file about Shinobu, they write, "From the blatant rivalry Shinobu displays towards Lum when Lum time travels to that era, it is clear that Shinobu had strong feelings for Ataru from the beginning. As a child, Ataru was precocious in his attraction to women, earning the nickname Snapping Turtle First Grader by attaching himself to girls he met in the street." This is exactly what happens in the animated adaptation. I actually showed footage of this episode back in my 5 Urusei Yatsura episodes you should watch video. It's a great addition to the book in my opinion, which gives me another reason to go back and read it more than once. Volume 2 talks about Shinobu and Cherry.
Well, who's that handsome devil?
While Volume 3 talks about Ran and Hanawa-sensei. I love the level of detail some of these analyses go into. In my opinion, it makes some of these an absolute must-read for hardcore fans. All this being said, I do think the quality of the analyses themselves are inconsistent. At their best, they give me new insight into a character, like Volume 3's data file on Ran. Ran likes to fill her surroundings with cute decorations. One example of this is Ran's UFO, which is also her home. In contrast to the mechanical dials and instruments of a spaceship, the interior has been completely redone to suit a girl with a penchant for fanciness. Her marionette welcome board and soft, lush shag carpeting bring the space together with a feeling of softness. They call attention to a visual detail that I wasn't really consciously aware of. The design of Ran's UFO was just one of those things my brain absorbed without me really consciously thinking about it. But looking at it now, I think it's really cool to see how Ran's personality is reflected in the design of her UFO. It was something that Rumiko actually thought through, an extra detail to flesh out the character and world just a little bit more. Now, at their worst, they're not awful, but they're definitely confusing and don't have too many interesting things to say. Take Volume 1's data file on Sakura. When Sakura first appears in the series, she lives in a humble one-story house, which later becomes a luxurious two-story home. Here, they've perhaps called attention to something that Rumiko wasn't thinking about, deciding in one chapter what Sakura's house should look like only for her to then change her mind later on. This inconsistency doesn't exactly ruin the series or anything, or make Sakura any less of an interesting character, but it's weird that the manga itself would be calling attention to this inconsistency. It makes me second guess just how carefully Rumiko actually thought a lot of this through, which then makes me wonder if the design of Ran's UFO wasn't deliberate at all, but instead just a really nice coincidence. However, for as much as I've spoken about it, I think it's a very minor flaw. It's one line out of the whole thing. I think the worst sin the data file commits is sometimes not being very interesting or insightful. It's still a nice bonus. The manga would have been totally fine without it, but I'm glad it was included. Of course, the real draw to these books are the stories, so let's actually break those down. I'll mainly be going into Volumes 2 and 3, but I may also briefly touch on Volume 1. In any series, whether that be games or movies or books, the number 2 is usually the cutoff for me. The make or break number. Mistakes can be made with the first iteration, but if the second iteration is just as bad or worse than the first, then you fucked up. This isn't always the case, obviously, but it's a pattern I've personally noticed. Now, I love Volume 1 despite all of its shortcomings. You know, there are a lot of them. But if we got 16 volumes identical to that one, I think I'd be far less sympathetic to some of the flaws. You can excuse bad storytelling in the first book, but by the fifth, it's a lot less forgivable. This is just the way I look at it personally. Luckily, Volume 2 is a vast improvement over the first. Volume 2 has what is quite possibly the most pivotal moment in this entire series, and honestly the most pivotal moment in any of Rumiko's series. The ones I've seen anyway. Now, people that are even vaguely familiar with this series are very familiar with Lum, and also probably the pairing of Lum and Ataru. However, as far as I can tell, Shinobu was originally supposed to be the main love interest for Ataru. I don't have a source, like an interview or something, but I don't think I really need to cite one. You can easily come to this conclusion yourself by just reading the damn manga. Ataru has his flirtatious moments, but ultimately comes running back to Shinobu. He dreams of marrying her. Then Lum comes in and ruins the fun. It cannot possibly get more clear than Volume 1, Chapter 5, Between a Rock and a Hard Place. In this chapter, Lum is clearly the antagonist. She tries to have Shinobu killed. She does it again later on. Nowhere is it more clear that Shinobu is the main love interest than in Volume 1, Chapter 12, Intention. In this chapter, Ataru and Lum accidentally travel to the future, only to discover a kid that is in fact Ataru's future son. Unbeknownst to Ataru and Lum, the kid's mother is Shinobu. If you ask me, things couldn't be more black and white. Shinobu is obviously the main love interest. It is literally destined to happen. However, if you know anything about the series, you know that this isn't the case. Lum is the main love interest, and Shinobu is just one of the many supporting characters. Can't confirm this myself, but this is supposedly because fans reacted more positively to Lum. So Rumiko began to play with the idea of Lum being the central love interest until eventually going full throttle in one crucial chapter. It's interesting because it's a very gradual shift in my opinion, until this pivotal chapter appears. Chapter 13, Puppet, is clearly before the shift began. Around the time you reach Volume 2, Chapter 3, without even saying goodbye, things are a little different. You can't confidently say Lum is the main love interest or that Shinobu isn't, but it's certainly more ambiguous in my opinion. While continuing to be weird even until the end of the series, you'll notice that Lum's bitchiness gets ratcheted down considerably. This trend continues until we get to Volume 2, Chapter 8, Love and Suffering. In this chapter, we can clearly see a shift. In this chapter, Lum is the protagonist, while Shinobu is, in a convoluted sort of way, the antagonist. In my reading, it's the first time Lum assumes this role. Lum almost comes close to being the protagonist of Volume 1, Chapter 17, Obsession is a Part of Love, but ultimately most of the chapter still focuses on Ataru. She comes close again in Volume 2, Chapters 6 and 7, Zodiac Cycles and Balmy Spring Days and the Failure Class. In this chapter, on the other hand, I think there's no question that Lum is the protagonist. A small portion of the chapter is devoted to Ataru and Shinobu, but Lum quickly steals the spotlight back from them. This chapter is pretty great in my opinion. For once, rather than just zapping the hell out of him, Lum is confused by Ataru's behavior, and actually wonders if she's doing something wrong. She gets the idea to disguise herself as an ordinary girl, and Ataru falls madly in love. Ataru then makes the unfortunate mistake of talking shit about Lum to Lum and swiftly gets his ass handed to him as a result. So I think by this point, Lum has become more of an interesting character. Any questions about her being the main love interest are immediately answered in the next chapter, which is possibly one of the series' most iconic chapters. Volume 2, Chapter 9, How I've Waited for You. Part of this chapter was adapted into the 10th episode of the anime, which is one of the series' most popular episodes. In this chapter, Ataru's classmates set up a fake date for him. Lum overhears their plan and eventually comes to Ataru's rescue. On their way home, Ataru stops and randomly takes note of how pretty Lum is. Ataru grabs her hand before she has the chance to fly away, and the two walk home together. It's wholesome AF, and it's also clear at this point that Lum is the main love interest. While I do like Shinobu as a character a lot, Lum is a much better fit for the main love interest of the series. It's at this point where the series begins to mold its way into its most recognizable form. Going back to Volume 1, it had a new drawing of Lum, courtesy of Rumiko Takahashi. More interesting, in my opinion, is the excerpt next to it. From the words of Rumiko herself, Lum is the Urusei character who is the most beyond my comprehension. It is much easier for me to relate to insecure characters who don't express how they really feel. A character like Lum, who is absolutely direct and uninhibited, is my polar opposite. Think of Ranma and Akane from Ranma Half. I think they both fit the description of characters that aren't completely honest with their feelings. Ataru and Lum are both the complete opposite of this. They perhaps weren't as relatable as characters like Tendo Akane, but in my opinion they are far more interesting. I managed to stumble across this interesting little study, which actually comes courtesy of Aaron Ehas, the head writer for Avatar: The Last Airbender. He says that characters should be dimensional, fascinating, compelling, and believable. He also warns against characters that are only likable, relatable, or sympathetic. Having a character that matches one of these criteria isn't bad at all. Relatability and likability are very powerful tools, but are, as he puts it, often misused. See, most of Ranma have for examples of that misuse in action. They're both kind of pushing it as far as believability is concerned, but they're definitely fascinating. Not gonna lie, I kinda love the fact that the leads for this show are these cartoonish, unrelatable freaks. This is a really strange comparison, but Lum reminds me of SpongeBob in a way. Only insofar as they both have a sense of childlike wonderment about them. Sometimes Lum will play the SpongeBob to Ataru's Squidward, like in episode 41 of the anime, which was actually the first episode I talked about in my first Urusei video. Anyways, Lum isn't a particularly relatable character, or she at least definitely wasn't for Rumiko Takahashi at the time. I also don't think Ataru is a particularly relatable character. Sure, most of us have had moments where some intense impulsiveness gets the better of us. Believe me, I can attest to that. But nothing comes close to Ataru's completely ridiculous one-track mind. He's not very intelligent. He can think of only one thing in any given moment, and that thing is usually hitting on girls and doing it badly at that. However, deep down on the inside, he is a good person. When push comes to shove, he will do the right thing. These traits just get more exaggerated as the series goes on. In my opinion, the personalities these characters settle into over the course of Volume 2 ends with them being far more interesting than how they originally were. Ataru was always a perv, but I think originally he was a lot closer to a character like Ranma. He's definitely still strange in these early stories, but you're supposed to relate to and sympathize with him. In these early chapters, a lot of bad stuff happens to him, and it's never his fault. As the series continues, Ataru will more often find himself looking for trouble rather than it just being thrust upon him by fate. Bad stuff continues to happen to Ataru, because that's kinda like just his thing, but the fact that you're less likely to relate to him and imagine yourself in his shoes really helps to mitigate the issue of the story feeling mean-spirited sometimes. When something shitty happens to Ataru, you'll often get the sense that he kinda deserves it. I admired the Shinobu era of Urusei a lot, but I respect the Lum era of Urusei a hell of a lot more. Plenty more happens in volumes 2 and 3, but this is by far the biggest and best change. Volume 2 introduces Mendo Shutaro, who is probably my favorite character in the animated adaptation. He's voiced by Akira Kamiya, whose voice you've probably already heard. Yeah, that's him. Mendo is rich. Absurdly rich. He's also a total playboy that women throw themselves onto. However, as established in his second chapter, he's just as much of a perv as Ataru is. There are a few key differences, however. Mendo has a little bit more self-control than Ataru, and is a little more forward-thinking. He won't just immediately give in to his impulses the way Ataru does. Most of the time, anyway. Their biggest difference is possibly the fact that Mendo is more shallow than Ataru. Ataru acts like a deranged force of nature most of the time, but occasionally a very good person shines through. That person doesn't exist inside Mendo. Almost every woman Mendo meets throws themselves on him, but he's only interested in the few that don't, with the most noteworthy example being Lum. In addition to making the relationship between Ataru and Lum more complicated, Mendo also gives Shinobu something to do after being demoted from her main character status. The love triangle is a lot more complex now as well. I think some of my favorite chapters and episodes from this era of the series are ones that focus on Ataru, Lum, Mendo, and Shinobu. Lots of really good character interaction here. Good character interaction in general is actually one of Volume 2's greatest strengths. I mentioned a few of the pivotal Ataru-Lum chapters already, but there are even more to talk about. Chapters 16 and 17, Exquisite Departure and Since You're Parting. In the former chapter, Ataru and Lum help out this weird little caterpillar. It's interesting since it's the first time we really see the two working together without any strings attached. This is a good example of the inner kindness that Ataru has, which Mendo lacks. I really like the theory that this kind streak of Ataru's is what Lum finds attractive, and that Lum doesn't express any interest in Mendo because he lacks this trait. The latter chapter is particularly iconic. Its animated adaptation is possibly the most beloved episode in the entire series. Lum leaves Ataru for what seems like for good. It's only temporary, obviously, but Ataru doesn't know that. The Ataru at the beginning of the series hated Lum and would have thrown a party over this, but at this point in the series, it seriously hurts him. I'm very familiar with the anime version of this story, but I enjoyed this version of the story a lot too. Something I noticed is how little dialogue there is in this chapter compared to other chapters. There's plenty of dialogue on most of the pages, but there are a couple with only a few text bubbles on them. It's a nice change of pace. This chapter is best enjoyed slowly, taking your time to actually admire the artwork and all the little details, rather than just burning through the text. Come to think of it, the entire manga in general is actually just best read slowly. One, because there are lots of really nice details that I think are worth taking the time to absorb, but more importantly, two, because binging this series is goddamn difficult. This entire series is very chaotic, and that's by design. There are some long chapters, there are some short chapters, but I found that each chapter tends to be around 20 pages or so on average. A lot happens within those 20 pages though. Volume 1 is by far the worst offender, but it creeps up in Volume 2 as well. Take Chapter 2, Disco Inferno. This chapter is absurdly hectic. So much happens in so little time, it's honestly hard to keep up with. The fact that this series is so heavy on Japanese references doesn't help for us Americans, although I suppose I'll go more into that in my brief notes about the translation. I think the chaos of Urusei's story is where a lot of its charm comes from, but it can get excessive sometimes, and sometimes it's difficult to follow the story. This chaos doesn't just manifest itself in the story, it's also very visually eclectic. I think it can turn some people off, but I personally love the visual messiness of this series. Sakura will look like a ridiculous caricature in one panel, only for her face to suddenly become very detailed and beautiful in the next. It seems totally wacky and random, but I actually think it's very deliberate. The different art styles are always used to get different moods across or to make a character's feelings and intentions more clear. I think the absolute best example of this is in the beginning of Volume 2, Chapter 8, Love and Suffering, in this genius little exchange between Ataru and Shinobu. Ataru spins a ridiculous story to let Shinobu know how much he cares about her, and Shinobu briefly falls for it.
Stupid white bitch.
Shinobu takes his declaration of love very seriously, while Ataru is just trying to flirt with her. Shinobu, who's experiencing this whirlwind of emotions, is drawn with heavy amounts of detail. Ataru, who's just trying to get with her, is drawn as this absurdly cartoonish idiot. It shows that the two are clearly not on the same wavelength. Without being consciously aware of any of these concepts at the time I first read it, I was able to look at these two panels and say, well, this isn't going to end well, and it doesn't. Almost all of the credit goes to the artwork for that reaction of mine. You could remove the dialogue from a lot of these scenes and get a good idea of what the characters are feeling, despite the completely ridiculous contents of the story. I think this is where the manga has a huge leg up over the anime. The anime didn't always have the time or the budget to implement this visual chaos. As if we needed any more proof that the clashing of different art styles is clearly deliberate, we needn't look any further than Volume 3. Volume 3 introduces Ran, or is it Ron? Ran is a childhood friend of Lum's. Ran appears to be this meek, adorable little girl, but is actually batshit crazy. See, back in Volume 1 we learned about Ray, this guy that actually manages to be dumber than Ataru. When he gets angry, he turns into a giant cow thing. Ray, as it turns out, was Lum's ex-fiancé. The reason I bring this up is because, as established in Ran's introductory chapter, Lum actually stole him from Ran. This is an amazing story beat in my opinion, but it won't really get elaborated on until much later, so if and when I do cover those volumes, I'll talk about it then. All you need to know is that it means some very interesting things for Ran and Lum as characters. Anyway, Ran's bipolar nature means that Rumiko gets to flex with all sorts of different designs for the character. When she puts on the facade of being innocent and cute, she's drawn with absolutely gigantic eyes, much bigger than normal for a character in this part of the story. I think it's supposed to look a little bizarre. This design doesn't fit in with the other characters, which is good. It's fake. When she reveals her true self, her eyes take on a completely different shape, one that's much more in line with how characters in this series look when they're being serious. Of course, there's also Ran's explosive temper, which, well, just look at it. Now that I've found myself creeping into Volume 3 territory, perhaps I should wrap up my opinions on Volume 2. It's really damn good. If you intend to go past Volume 1, which I would highly recommend doing, Volume 2 is the most important one. It's where the series goes from being good to great. It's far from perfect. It's a little rough sometimes, but this volume reaches some incredible highs. The art, while sometimes suffering from the occasional anatomical oddity, is otherwise fantastic. I think this is where the contrast really starts to do some work. While it won't go away completely, the series will see the clashing of art styles get dialed back quite a bit as it goes on. Volume 1 is great, but it's really rough. You've got to sort of meet it halfway. Volume 2, on the other hand, will meet you all the way. Well, all the way except for the occasional hiccup. I honestly couldn't recommend this one enough. On to Volume 3, I also really like this one. I don't love it quite as much as Volume 2, but to be fair, you can only completely rework the main love interest for the better so many times. What, are we gonna have Ataru fall in love with the dinosaur? Quite a few of the early chapters of Volume 3 move the focus towards the high school. Urusei is respected as being one of the main inspirations for the high school anime, so it's interesting to note that this series wasn't always like this. Yet another example of how this series changed a lot during this period. The series ended in a completely different place than where it began, unlike basically every other Rumiko series. The ones I've seen anyway. You'll now probably start to notice that a lot of the stories at this point can be structurally similar. They'll often draw from a few templates. The most common I've found to be are the ones where some spirit or alien will touch down and cause trouble, with the designs for the supernatural beings often taking inspiration from old Japanese mythology. One concept that we see a bit of here and we'll see a lot more of when 10 gets introduced are the Lum gadget stories. Stories where Lum, and later on 10, will introduce some alien tech made with the intent to perform some basic task like copying notes. In practice, these gadgets usually end up causing tons of trouble as well. Much less common, but still recurring, are the stories that mostly focus on a stranger to the world of Urusei, such as Volume 3's chapters about Kaide. Not all of the stories fall into these categories, but a fair amount of them do. Rumiko is not too dissimilar from Tonetta in this respect. She's not afraid to reuse concepts for stories. Well, that was an obscure reference and a half. Also, given that many of these stories are structurally very similar, it's amazing that I don't find this series to be that repetitive. At the absolute least, it's nowhere near as repetitive as something like Ranma. You know, I didn't set out to pick on that series when I started writing this video, that's just where we wound up. Anyway, I honestly can't describe exactly why I feel this way, but if I had to guess, I'd say that I feel the character interaction is always fresh. To bring up Ranma for the sake of argument, almost every time Ranma and Akane interact, it is the most predictable crap in the world. Ranma really does love Akane! He's just too afraid to admit it! XD! Meanwhile, for all the chapters where Ataru acts all standoffish towards Lum, there are just as many where the two are getting along, no strings attached. They're just hanging out, shooting the shit, assaulting the feces with a firearm. We almost always get something out of the character interaction in this series. Volume 3 introduces Mizunokoji Tobimaru, who often just gets called Tone for short. He is not an amazing character. I'm sure there's potential for an interesting character in here somewhere, but it sadly never really gets elaborated on within the series. We do meet his sister, who I think is a fun character, but that isn't until much later. All that being said, I do find his introduction to be pretty amazing, like how he randomly just eats baseballs. That's weird. This whole chapter is weird, come to think of it. There's some really strange gags that I think I love, although I'm honestly not sure. After a few chapters of some formative high school anime stuff, we take a break as all the characters go on vacation. I'm assuming that these chapters were written during the summer. I'd say it's a nice change of pace from all the school chapters, but we only kinda just got acquainted with them. There are some great stories to come from the summer part of the story. One of my favorites is Chapter 7, Bathing Suit Bandit. The ending genuinely got a really big laugh out of me. I won't spoil it. One chapter I absolutely loved was Chapter 8, Snatch the Bikini. This chapter is... This was one of the chapters that was never actually adapted into the anime. It's really, really weird. It's also pretty damn funny. Eventually, summer comes to an end, and it's got an entire chapter to send it off. I've gotta say I really like the diversity between settings in this series. It gets called a neighborhood manga and a high school manga fairly often, but it explores many different settings. Rumiko makes good on the fact that some of her characters have access to alien technology or own luxurious vacation homes. It's yet another way that this series avoids being repetitive. I dig it. Soon, summer ends and it's back to school. It's at this point where Lum becomes a student at the school. A very minor character gets introduced as well. His name is Hanawa Sensei. I like him. Not an incredibly deep character, but he got a laugh out of me and he doesn't overstay his welcome. The first chapter of this arc is fun, but the second one is strange. Rather than continue to focus on the newly introduced Hanawa Sensei or watch Lum acclimate to the school, we instead detour to focus on a different character entirely. Natsuko, the volleyball coach. Okay, it doesn't exactly work out that way, to be fair. We get some pretty funny interaction between her and Hanawa, and Lum gets distracted during volleyball practice, which angers Natsuko, leading her to reveal more about herself. You know, Lum and Hanawa are still part of the story. Still, I'd have some heavy criticism for this if it weren't for the fact that we can get a pretty good idea why the story takes this turn if we keep reading. She clearly exists to add to the visual insanity of this manga. Her face will randomly contort into these insane shapes, and I fucking love it. If you ask me, it's worth the rocky storytelling just to see this shit. Unfortunately, after a really great chapter where we meet Lum's mom, we detour yet again. We focus on Kaide, the incompetent ninja. Personally, I don't enjoy these chapters that much. I think Kaide is a pretty fun character, and there are some pretty good jokes sprinkled throughout these chapters, but I think they're a little too chaotic, even for Urusei. There's just too many new concepts, characters, and setting being introduced in such a short time. First time I read this manga, I had to take a break between these chapters, because it's just too much. What's worse is that this character never shows up again outside of a one-off episode in the anime. Really glad we took the time to get to know this character. You know, you see how it paid off for us? Not unbearable, but definitely the lowest point in Volume 3. Lastly, we get to the introduction of Ran. She's a great character. She gets introduced at the very end of the manga, so I won't have a ton to say about her now, especially since I spoke about her earlier. She's a great rival for Lum. She also has the unique ability to suck people's youth away by kissing them. She's a cum-guzzling semen demon. It's a cool technique that goes mostly unused in the latter half of the series, if I recall correctly anyway. Soon, she'll be given more backstory, and eventually she'll assume a completely different role in her relationship with Lum. It's a change I think is for the better, but I suppose we'll get to that when we get to that. All things considered, despite all of its hiccups, I thoroughly enjoyed my time with Volume 3. Before I wrap this up, however, I think I need to give some of my thoughts on the translation, in case any folks at Viz happen to be watching. I seriously doubt it, but if you are, ni hao, my bitches! Anyway, let's talk about the translation. Something I want to make clear is that translation is not math. There's no absolutely correct, foolproof way of translating between two languages, especially between two as complex as Japanese and English. For example, compare the old and new translations of this panel back from Chapter 1. Ataru is scared by Lum's father, so he throws some beans at him, which seems kind of random, but in the original Japanese manga, this is a clear reference to a holiday called Setsubun. You throw, like, beans or some shit, I don't know, Google it. In the old translation, Ataru says, "Wait, I get it, trick or treat, right? Okay, here, candy," making a joke about Halloween. It's a cool workaround, but you lose the original intent. The new translation just has him saying, "Ogres be gone," which is a direct reference to the holiday. This preserves the original intent at the cost of making it a little more strenuous to read. Still, the new translation is obviously better in this case, especially because Setsubun gets brought up quite a few times in Volume 1 alone, so they can only sidestep the issue for so long. However, there is a discussion to be had about just how much should get changed. I think you've got to find a good middle ground between accessibility and accuracy. On one end of the spectrum, we've got Steve Simmons subtitles for Dragon Ball Z. This one keeps all the honorific shit at the end of names. Kami-sama, Goku-san, Son-kun. It requires a level of effort from the viewer to understand what these suffixes mean, but it preserves the original intent. Trunks calls him Goku-san because a quirk of Trunks' character is that he's incredibly polite. Excessively polite. If he just calls him Goku, you ever so slightly lose something there. However, if you ask some normie what the difference between Goku and Goku-san is, they're not going to have any idea what you're talking about. So, if we just always refer to Lum as Lum, the way that Anime Ego's subtitles do, it's a lot easier on the eyes, and requires less effort or pre-existing knowledge from the viewer. However, when you do this, you lose some of the original intent, and it can be awkward at times too. For example, let's look at episode 24, the body swap episode. Ataru normally just calls Lum, Lum, while Ten calls her Lum-chan. Ten, while inhabiting Ataru's body, calls her Lum-chan, to which Lum acts surprised to hear. This is because Ataru normally doesn't refer to her this way. However, the subtitles ignore the suffixes, so now it reads as Lum being confused to hear her name uttered in the way it's always pronounced by this character. Well, fuck, now she's got dementia. While I tend to prefer that not much get changed, I did find some issues with the translation. I just want to say that before I get to criticizing how much I appreciate this release from Viz, and how absolutely heartwarming it's been to see the series treated with this level of respect. As I said back in my Volume 1 review, my interest in this series was completely renewed thanks in large part to this translation, and this manga continues to keep me engaged. I'm incredibly grateful to the people at Viz for this translation. Also, to defend them further, Urusei is a very difficult series to translate, not just because of how notoriously chaotic this series is, but also because this series is very heavy on Japanese references. Heavier than what was normal for the time. The amount of time that has passed also hasn't helped. This series has aged surprisingly well, but I imagine that some topical at the time reference will sprout up eventually, making the process even more strenuous on them. I say all this to put into perspective just how amazing it is that this series is even readable, let alone way more engaging than it has any business being. This is some excellent work, and the inclusion of the note section is absolute genius on their part. However, I did notice some things that I would have probably changed. There are times where I think they balance it perfectly, making a minor change and elaborating on it within the notes section. For example, in this chapter, Cherry yells, "Hi-ya!" and Shinobu's top loosens. I looked at this and thought, oh, it's Cherry exercising his spiritual powers in some way, what with, the gesture he makes and everything. Now, if we go to the notes section and read, we can see this. In the Japanese edition, Cherry yells, "Katsu!" which is a vocal exclamation meant to admonish a Zen practitioner, as well as to induce initial enlightenment in a student. It is used as a means to focus energy, and Cherry's shout is so powerful that Shinobu's bikini top loosens. It's incredibly readable, and while not one-to-one perfect, I think "Hi-ya!" gets the idea across good enough. Then you can go to the notes and see what was changed. What I'm trying to get across is that you can mostly follow the story without the notes. They're just there to enhance your reading experience, I guess. In some cases, however, I think more could be changed. The worst offender is near the very end of Volume 3 in Chapter 21, Drama Festival Close Call. This chapter is really heavy on Japanese references, as well as a reference to Journey of the West. My first read of this chapter just left me exhausted. I had no idea what the fuck was happening, and I honestly still don't. The notes section saved my life here. elaborated on all of the references. However, the chapter just left me confused. The joke wasn't really funny since I needed to have it explained to me. I think more could have been done to change the dialogue to make it a bit more readable. The original intent will get lost in the process, but as it stands right now, it's just utterly incomprehensible to my feeble American mind. Still, it's not the biggest deal, it's just one chapter out of dozens, and this was the only one I had this much trouble getting through. The translation doesn't just have issues like these, where the translation doesn't go far enough. There are also some instances where I think it goes too far. There is some totally inconsequential stuff, like how the Red Mantle is referred to as the Red Cloak. He appears in one chapter, it's really not a big deal. Throughout all 3 volumes, the Oni are referred to as ogres. Not a terribly inaccurate translation. In fact, it's probably the best one they could go with, but I think I would prefer it be kept as Oni. Still, I can live with the change. There's the given name family name switch, which I mentioned back in my Volume 1 video. I'm still not a fan, but I can live with the change. One change I seriously don't like, though, is how they address this character. This is Onsen Mark. He's known for having this symbol all over his clothes. From what I know, this is the symbol for onsen, which means hot spring. So his name, Onsen Mark, could be interpreted as Mark of the Hot Spring. However, you could also read it as Onsen being his family name and Mark his given name. The name Mark isn't common for Japan-born people, but it's not totally out of the realm of possibility, especially for us American readers. I like the name a lot because it's subtle. You could gather that his name means Mark of the Hot Spring, but you could just as easily guess that his first name is Mark and his last name is Onsen. Rumiko is actually well known for her creative character names. For example, all of the tenants in Mason Ikoku are named after the rooms they stay in. Miss Ichinose is in room 1, with the Ichi being the Japanese word for 1. Godai is in room 5, and the Go means 5, you get the idea. I think calling them Mrs. 1 or Mr. 5 would be missing the point. I say all this because, they call him Hot Spring Emblem? Yeah, that's the name they went with. Now, granted, this only appears in the data file at the end of Volume 3, so what I'm hoping is that this is just some anomaly that's not going to appear again. That in mind, I really hope they don't go with this name for the future. It just kills the subtlety and believability of the original name without the benefit of making it more readable. Hot Spring Emblem is just a mouthful, and it doesn't sound at all like a person's name. You know, I've heard somewhere that Shinobu's name could be very roughly translated to mean to endure. You guys are Lum fans? I'm an Endurance fan, personally.
Stanima.
I just want to end this off by saying that I thoroughly enjoyed this manga a lot, and I will continue to enjoy and recommend this manga even if this issue doesn't get addressed. But I hope that it does. Pretty please?
Come on!
Anyways, that's about it for my thoughts on Urusei Yatsura Volumes 2 and 3. Go buy them. They're good. Especially Volume 2. Ended up having way more to say than I initially anticipated, so if you stuck through it all the way, thanks, bruh. One thing I do want to say before I officially sign out is that a joke I wrote at the beginning, where I allude to bad podcasts, was not in reference to this podcast called The Lum Squad. I actually listened to this whole podcast and it was damn good. It's sitting around at exactly a Badman Reviews tier number of views, which is a damn shame. I think Lum Ranmayasha, who's the host, talks a little fast, and it kind of scares me. I don't agree with a lot of the criticisms, and it's long, but I enjoyed it a lot. Shame they never did a second episode. Don't know how much I'd recommend it, since I think you need to be fairly acquainted with the series to get a lot out of it, but to the microscopic portion of my microscopic audience that's intrigued, maybe go watch it. Or don't. I don't know. I can't control you. I can't force you to do anything. If you decide to leave a comment on this video with the Monica Real copy pasta, I am physically incapable of preventing you from doing so. I may be able to delete your comment after it's posted, but I cannot spend the time and effort to pry the keyboard from your hands. It's a miserable existence, but I suck it up and I drive on. And I hope, you all suck up lots of stuff too. Anyway, yeah. Here's a meme.
Don't believe in charity.